at one point you attended seminary and you studied to be a minister. Now, you've said that your road to atheism began with your seeking to learn how to best to witness to atheists. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. How did that go down?
Well, I never attended seminary. So
okay.
That gets passed around as a claim all over the place. So that I think it's popped up even on Wikipedia at one point, but I haven't corrected. I had intentions of going to seminary at one point, but I found my way out of religion prior to that. My roommate at the time was an atheist, and I'd spent 8 years in the military and then worked in the tech industry. And while as a teenager, there were people in my family and in my church who, were convinced that God wanted me to be a minister, and I was terrified of public speaking, so, I had a girlfriend, I went in the Navy, I didn't want to be a preacher. And then after being in the Navy and working in the tech industry and losing my job, I thought God was punishing me. I thought God was saying, hey, I called you to ministry, you decided to focus on your career, and now I'm going to take all that away. So I got serious and spent about a year and a half or so in pretty serious prayer and study. And because my roommate was an atheist, and we were best friends and have been for years, I didn't want to get right with God, and I didn't want to die and get up to heaven and have God say, hey, why is this guy who you love like a brother burning in hell because you refuse to share the gospel? So I set out to try to find the best ways to communicate the gospel to someone who was an atheist. I had a lot of confusion about this because growing up steeped in religion and surrounded by everyone who believes similar to me, I'd certainly met and witnessed to a lot of atheists. I just didn't know enough to know they were atheists. It was like, in my mindset at the time as a believer, there were people who didn't believe, but they weren't atheists. Atheists were, rabid, God-hating, God-denying, and so it was fundamentally different to talk to someone who just didn't believe.
Right.
I've come to realize that, that they are atheists. But this process of trying to find the best way to have the conversation with him ended up backfiring rather spectacularly, and I ended up a non-believer.
That's fantastic. Well, that's a fantastic story. There's a misconception a lot of Christians have. I certainly had it when I was a Christian, was that, atheists are all people who start out as Christians who are angry with God for some reason, and it's kind of like that misconception that people who are in porn films obviously were abused by children. Now, as you know, everyone's paths to whatever they do in life are different. There's no one broad explanation that covers everybody. But, what are your thoughts on that? Like, why do you think that or the fact that they think that we worship the devil? Like, why do you think that these misconceptions exist and are so prevalent?
Well, I think a lot of it is the fact that religions have had a somewhat unfair advantage. Everything that people know about atheists up until the popularity of the internet probably came from the preachers and the other believers around them. And so you kind of build atheists up into this myth. And most people had seen perhaps Madeline Murray O'Hare, and that was their only knowledge about atheists. Another aspect is that we're all convinced that we're right. If we didn't think we were right, we would change our minds, change our positions. And so if you are a believer, and I guess I can primarily stick with Christianity because, it's what I grew up with. That's what's popular in the United States and the West. If you think that you have the truth and there's a God who loves you and everything else, Christianity is one of the religions that has the correct defense mechanisms to have survived this long. Basically, when religions make claims that are easily debunked, they fall by the wayside. And when you have this idea that you have the truth and that there's a God who cares about you, and you've made a public profession of faith, all of those things work together to set it up so that you can't possibly be wrong.
Right.
So one of my probably biggest pet peeves, and this came up in a debate that I did in Canada, myself and Krista Carlo against two ministers. And he made the assertion that we've all heard over and over again, that, oh, well, if you would just open up your heart willingly to God, he would reveal himself to you. And when you try to say that you have in fact done this, their response is, well, no, you haven't. There was something wrong with your heart, or something wrong with the way you did it, or whatever else. And all they're really saying is, whether or not you're a true Christian, I mean, that's kind of a separate thing. I did a video
but they say that stuff. There's always a reason why. To discount whatever it is that you find or believe or.
Well, the issue here is that they set something up where they can't be wrong.
Right.
Because if you made the appeal to God and you need an answer, that's your fault.
Right.
There's something fundamentally wrong with you. So they set up an unfalsifiable proposition, a no-lose situation, essentially, that it makes them more comfortable with dealing with that situation. Because if they have to admit that I sincerely and in all the correct fashions reached out to God and got no response, then they would have to acknowledge they're wrong, and everything begins to crumble after that.
Right. Now, you personally, in your story, like when you first came out as an atheist, like, when you first revealed it, how was this news met by your friends and family? I mean, were there people who were mad? Did they try to talk you out of it? How did that go?
Yeah, it's been a strange mix. I was actually hosting the TV show before I had come out to any of my relatives. I was planning on potentially writing a book that would make the subject accessible, particularly to my parents.
Right.
Because I was trying to figure out the best way to have the conversation. I was actually outed by an uncle, and what ended up happening was it caused a rift. My relationship with my parents is fine today, despite the fact that they are still convinced that I'm working for Satan. But it was a really difficult time because, my dad told me that, I couldn't love anybody because God is love, and without God in my life, it's impossible for me to love anybody. And so if I tried to end a phone call, it was, okay, I love you, Dad. It was kind of, no, you can't.
Nice.
But I love you. There was a lot of this using the religious belief as a weapon, as a form of attack, because they were on the defense. They had to, what ended up happening is that it becomes very difficult to reconcile the fact that here is your child who you know is a good person, who you observe doing good things, who you love, and yet the God that you desperately hope is real and are convinced is true is telling you, or the religion is telling you, that this individual is not only lost and deserving of hell, but is someone that you shouldn't interact with because of what they're doing. So things will never return to the old normal, but we've established kind of a new normal. My wife had far more difficulty with some of her relatives, but that sorted itself out over about 4 years. I'm more worried about young people that I hear from who acknowledge their atheism and are then thrown out by their parents. We've had to, help relocate a couple different people and find places for them to live because, I think the internet video that everybody kind of laughs at where the kid told these folks that, he's an atheist, and the initial reaction is no Christmas presents for you, kind of the screaming.
Right.
And it's clear that they're desperate to say something, but they don't know how to deal with it. And when I called and told my dad, he didn't. I think he said something along the lines of, "Okay, I'm gonna have to think about this," and then hung up. And then what I found out that he did is he went to Wikipedia and looked up atheist.
Right.
And shortly thereafter, he and my mom went to a Lee Strobel event to talk to Lee. Hey, our son's an atheist. What should we do? And Lee just sold him a couple of his books. And last year, when I had the chance to finally meet Lee, I told him that story and suggested that he stop just shoveling his books to parents and actually tell them to talk to their kids.
Right. I have a question for you. What is your opinion on this? as is clear here, and is clear to all of us, most times whenever you tell someone that you're an atheist and they're not an atheist, they take that as a personal attack to them, to their belief. Whereas, we don't feel that way. Like, unless you're pushing your shit on me, I don't feel attacked by the fact that somebody believes in Jesus. Why do they take it as a personal attack or an affront that we don't feel the same way?
I think it's two things. I think one of quite often it's been drilled into them in some form or other that atheists are in opposition to Christ and religion.
Right.
And therefore you're immediately viewed as dangerous and the enemy. And the second factor of this is that I don't want to pretend that I can read people's minds, but I know that believers constantly struggle with doubt. Otherwise, there wouldn't be apologetics. Otherwise, all these discussions wouldn't happen. And I think that the kind of knee-jerk fear reaction is a resolution to some cognitive dissonance, because on some level, they have to realize that what they believe it could easily be viewed as preposterous.
Right.
And if they entertain, there may be a fear that if they entertain the notion long enough or seriously enough, that they may lose their belief, and that's something that you desperately, don't want to happen.
Right. Now, over the years, you've become famous for your debates with Christian apologists. You've had a million of them. And when you go into a debate like that, like personally for you, what is your goal? Like, what do you hope to accomplish when you enter into that debate?
I'm not trying to change my opponent's mind, but I am trying to reach people in the audience who may watch this. And the key goals for me are that I need to keep in mind that this is probably going to be somebody's initial introduction to, secularism, atheism, humanism, skepticism. They will never encountered this stuff before. So
right.
Part of it is making sure that I'm going to be the best representative I can be. And the other goal is to make sure that the discussion is as honest as possible. If it turns out there's a God, I'd love to know. But if all I'm going to be offered is anecdotes and fallacies and absurdities, then I think there's a responsibility to point those out as honestly and forthrightly as possible. There's a lot of debate is quite often theater,
right?
Where you might actually have the best arguments, but if the other person, through their personality or whatever, connects more, the facts can get overlooked. And right. I'm trying to push away from structured debates, which, to quote from the West Wing, are more like a joint press conference, and move more towards discussions, because I trust audience members to be able to look at this and tell who is thinking and who has spent time thinking about this and who is regurgitating somebody else's thoughts, stock lines, who is actually responding to what their opponent is saying and pushing back and asking for clarification and trying to get to some understanding, and who is just there to preach.
Right. Most of us are not as skilled or as experienced as you at having these debates, with Christian apologists, but they do come up from time to time. And I'm curious, in your mind, what are some things that you think that should be seen as being important for a person to recognize, or to recognize or to be aware of up front when going into such a debate?
There's a handful of them. There's a couple of talks that I gave on some tips, and I'm not going to remember all of them today.
Right.
But I would say going into it with the right motivations is key. If you're just going in to show how smart you are or make fun
right.
of the opposition or mock, that's probably not the best course of action. You should always acknowledge that you may in fact be wrong. You should be honest. I hate bad arguments, but I hate them most when they come from people who are defending the positions that I think are reasonable, which means I end up arguing and fighting with, atheists as much as anybody.
Right.
There's always the sense of the need to listen and not just, wait for their time to be up so you can speak.
Right.
But I think the key is if you actually acknowledge that you put the burden of proof where it should rest. If someone is claiming that they, something supernatural, there is a God, there's an afterlife or a resurrection or something like that, they have a burden of proof. It's not up to you to prove them wrong. That may in fact be impossible because they could have an unfalsifiable position. That's worth exposing. And what I see many people doing is, in order to push back even harder, they will begin to engage in hyperbole, a sort of exaggeration that puts them in a position where they now have a burden of proof. So instead of just saying, somebody claims there's a God, please provide your case for this, and then pointing out how and why they haven't met their burden of proof, some people might respond, there are no gods.
Right.
Okay, well, you may be able to demonstrate that. It kind of depends on definitions. But I think it's a mistake to do that unless you are confident that you can meet that burden of proof. Because if you fail to meet that burden of proof, in the minds of many, the other side wins. Because you've switched to where the default position is. And the default position should be, I will not and do not believe that a God exists until such time as it's been demonstrated. This would be true for any claim. I will not and do not believe there are no gods until that claim is met its proof.
Right. Now, in the debates that you've had, I know that you've had a lot of stuff thrown at you, to varying degrees of quality, should I say. I'm curious, what stand out in your mind as some of the more ridiculous statements or arguments that you can remember? You don't have to go into who they are or anything, but what are some of the crazier arguments for the existence of Jesus, for the existence of God that you've encountered?
I think one of the strangest ones was actually when I was debating the issue of whether or not Jesus rose from the dead. And my opponent started by saying that there's two lines of evidence. The first was to show that reality has a supernatural component to it. And the second line was to show that the historical evidence seems to indicate that Jesus rose from the dead. Now, first thing is only the second line of evidence is relevant to the debate. The first line is an attempt to poison the well. Because if you get people to believe in supernatural, then all of a sudden there's a proposed explanation surrounding everything you're trying to prop up later on. But in the first part where he's trying to argue for the supernatural component, he's telling stories about Ouija boards and trash can lids flying and a church praying for a certain amount of money, and that amount of money happens to arrive.
Right.
And all of these, this is a demonstration of just seriously flawed epistemology, a failure to understand and apply skepticism and critical thinking.
Right.
Because I'm happy to believe that somebody's had an experience that they do not have an explanation for it. But when you assert that you do, the trash can lid moved, I'm happy to believe the trash can lid moved. I don't think, maybe they're lying, maybe they're not. But if you then say the trash can lid moved because of the ghost, now you've offered up an explanation, and you need to actually demonstrate that. You don't just get to say, I can't think of any better explanation, because that's how we've gotten to every error, is I can't think of a better explanation.
Right. What, you've talked in the past about getting, I know that you've had some feedback from people that have ultimately changed their mind as a result of things that you've said, or maybe that sent them down a path of researching further. And I'm curious, what is it like when to know that you've reached those people, and does that happen frequently?
It happens all the time. There's thousands of emails. I've been hosting TV shows for 14 years and done a bunch of debates, plus the calls on the show. Almost everywhere I go to, I was in Chicago for an event with Lawrence Cross and Sam Harris Saturday night, and there were just shy of 3,000 people, and I met, a couple dozen or more who were wanting to thank me for helping them escape religion and, become a skeptic or become a humanist, etc. And my answer to all of them is the same, that for me, I like that this has happened because it's always good to know that your efforts, the time and you put into something has been helpful to people.
Right.
But I also let them know that don't give me credit for changing your mind. You changed your mind. There were 1,000 other people who heard me say the same thing, and they didn't change their mind. So own the fact that you were willing to follow the evidence where it led, that you were willing to, acknowledge that you might be wrong, and open to changing your mind. I used to joke, I'm just a guy who talks a lot, and you're the one that did all the work. It doesn't quite play out like that because, clearly I don't completely suck at what I do, and people have found it useful. And I'm thrilled when that happens. But I also want people to acknowledge that they are the ones that did the hard work, and they were the ones who were open to changing, and there are so many others who seem to be immune to reasonable discussion.
Right. On the opposite side of that, as far as feedback, do you still get much negative feedback? I mean, do you get hate mail? Do you get, what does that look like? Does that still happen?
I don't get much hate mail. It's actually been pretty rare over the years. We get tons of email, and certainly there are some people who are occasionally contentious, but it's been there have been a handful of threats over the years and a handful of really hateful messages. And largely, I ignore them. There were a couple threats that were, to the show in general and some specific hosts, and I know those were reported to the authorities, but I always said I was more worried about the people. I think the people that are potentially dangerous aren't going to email or call to tell you about how they want to kick your butt.
Right.
And there's not much I can do about it either way. I guess I've been lucky in the sense that I haven't had to be too concerned with that. There are certainly some tenacious individuals who will email repeatedly, and we've received some emails from people who are clearly mentally disturbed in some fashion or off their medications. And as I'm not a health expert, I don't try to diagnose them, and I don't try to interact. But when the emails are incredibly disjointed and scattered, I mean, I've probably got 13,000 unread emails right now. So it's really easy for me to just focus on the conversations that I have a good reason to think they're going to be somewhat productive. Right.
I wanted to touch a little bit on you. You've been having that speaking tour with Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins and Lawrence Krauss, and I wondered what is that experience like? And what is it like? Working with those guys.
No, it's a little different every time. I mean, Richard and I met many years ago, but having private conversations with somebody or interacting, just being at the same convention is a little different from trying to speak together on stage. And so you've got to build up a little bit of rapport and find out what conversations each one likes. So the first event that Sam and I did together was also with Richard in London, and Sam and I had only met once before for about a minute, and there's no reason for him to remember that at all. So the London event was kind of, it wasn't a bad event. I think most people liked it, but we didn't know enough about each other to really have a good conversation. I think that improved a lot in New York, and then we did Chicago last week, and I took more of a back seat. I was specifically offering up questions in more of a host role. I mean, I know I'm there to contribute as well as, kind of direct the flow of traffic. But when you Sam is incredibly popular, and so if you have a 3,600 seat theater, I know that the bulk of the people there want to hear what Sam has to say. But I'm never going to put myself in a position where I'm merely interviewing someone, because I think I have things to contribute as well. So I think we've gotten to the point where, everybody's comfortable with everybody, and we can have good conversations, and I can sit back and be quieter on occasion, or I can jump in. And Lawrence loves to go toe-to-toe with either one of us. We had a 30-minute probably discussion on free will, and Lawrence and I have taken Sam to task on this Buddhist idea of losing the sense of self. And it's, whereas I used to be, we talked about living in Chicago. One of the reasons I didn't want to become a preacher is because I had a fear of public speaking, and it's ironic now because that has completely vanished. I think the biggest reason for me is that if you're not trying to BS anybody, if you are willing to acknowledge that you don't, if you don't try to pretend that you know things that you don't know, and you're not overly concerned about, people's opinions of you, if you're just being who you are and honest about who you are, I found that the fear of public speaking just kind of vanishes. You either like me or you don't. You either agree with me or you don't. We can either have a conversation or we can't. I can't really change that.
Right.
So I really enjoyed, these events and getting to know Sam and Richard more, and Lawrence too. And there will be more. We're doing one more in Phoenix with me, Lawrence, and Sam, and then I start off on kind of a solo world tour with a Magic and Skepticism show. Although we're going to take one of those events and completely change it, and I'm going to sit down with Jordan Peterson and have a discussion in Toronto.